Democracy. To many, this word simply means the right of people to elect who governs them, and the right of people to hold their elected officials to account and remove them should they wish to. Now, the dictionary definition states that democracy is a form of government in which the supreme power is vested in the people collectively and is administered by them or by officers appointed by them. Now, the definition goes on to imply other things, including the more modern interpretations of the word. So to examine what it actually is and how it's changed over time, we're going to go back a bit, and we're going to go back to ancient Greece and the Athenian society. Now, this is because it is here where democracy is widely believed to have come from, so I think it'll be good to set the scene. Ancient Greece was certainly not a democracy in the modern sense of the word, and instead comprised of inhabited areas known as city-states. These city-states formed over many hundreds of years when families, groups and tribes of people joined together for protection against outside threats. Each city united by their culture and shared values. Now, my view holds that as humans are tribal, they are quick to see the benefits of forming groups and consequently will go to great lengths to keep the group together. Over time, people within each city-state will have come to rely on their fellow citizens, forming a bedrock of trust within the community. Now, as we are talking about ancient Greece here, it's hard to know exactly how this all came about. Having said that, the most well-documented civilization in ancient Greece, Athens, does provide some compelling convergence of evidence for just how successful this particular civilization was. All myths lose their grasp on the souls of men. Leisure rises, inquiry is supported, science and philosophy grow. Athens becomes the most intensely alive city of her time. In Athenian society, wisdom and inquiry were looked up to, and it was believed that wisdom was something to be cherished, a virtue more lasting than any other possession. With wisdom, reason and thought encouraged, the Athenian people began to ponder new ways of ruling. Rule, it was argued, needn't simply be assigned to a person, as was the norm at the time, so, for example, a king or a pharaoh. For the Athenians, the answer could potentially lie with law. Law that all citizens, including those in power, would be bound by. It was said that man became free when he recognised he was subject to law. Having everybody under the law, including leaders, was believed to give the people a greater level of protection in their lives from arbitrary abuses of power. It was also felt that this would civilise people and make them more susceptible to reason and less susceptible to emotional impulses. Now, it is worth noting here that of course you don't need to be a democracy to have a rule of law, but law itself has become a crucial component of democracy today. Athens itself would go on to acquire greater confidence, especially after a series of military victories, most notably defeating the Persians and saving themselves from subjugation. As time went on, however, Athenian society would see an ever greater disparity between the rich and the poor, something its leaders seen as both politically and socially unsustainable in a democratic setting, as people were expected to become resentful. So, realising the danger, the Athenians sought to quell the discord. The Greek philosopher Plutarch is quoted as saying, "The city seemed to be in a truly dangerous condition, and no other means for freeing it from disturbances seemed possible but a despotic power." Here's another quote from the life of Greece. "The poor finding their situation worse each year, the government and the army in the hands of their masters, and the corrupt courts deciding every issue against them, began to talk of a violent revolt and a thoroughgoing redistribution of wealth." So, a threat to the established order saw the entrance of Solon among others. They were tasked with quelling the feud and mitigating between the classes. Athens was ultimately reorganised and the rule of law was applied to all free men. Debits were cancelled and the city was politically reorganised. So, let's have a think about where policy is made these days. You're probably thinking of a meeting room or a government chamber, for example. But in Athenian society, it was the Pnyx, and it was there in the hills of Athens that citizens would descend upon 10 times a year to engage in direct democracy. Issues would be raised, debated, and at the end there would be a show of hands. Whosever idea won became policy. The ideas discussed were chosen by a council of 500, who were selected at random by Athenian citizens, but the assembly upon the Pnyx was supreme. So the people ultimately had the ability to shut down ideas or request redrafts, This was direct democracy. A modern example of this would be a referendum, in which all people have the chance, should they wish, to vote on an issue, one way or the other. The decision, therefore, is not taken by elected representatives, but by the people themselves. Now, going back to Athenian society, no decision was beyond the National Assembly, and this included foreign policy. This means that in the mid-4th century, when Philip of Macedon was marching upon Athens, it was the people who had to decide how to proceed. Should they fight or negotiate? All the while knowing a wrong move could have meant the fall of their society. But looking back at how long democratic Athens endured, it does stand to reason, I think, that it is likely it comprised of a very competent and politically aware public. The society was clear and organised. Now, some may argue today that as only free adult males were granted democratic privileges, the city wasn't democratic at all, as most Athenian people were denied political rights. But here we have to accept again that we are talking about an ancient civilization, thousands of years ago, and that these exclusions were normal for the time. I think it's also important to remember just how thorough the people's control was over the government. So, taking that into consideration, and the fact that the exclusions were normal for the time, I think it's fair to call Athens democratic. So, as time went on, Athenian society became expensive, with wages to pay, and so the Athenians began to seek empire, attempting to spread its influence over much of Greece. But this was met with resistance, and finally, the fall of Athens itself. So, I want to jump ahead to the 17th century, a time in which Athenian society is now ancient history, and before the founding of the United States. A time when philosophers and intellectuals were contemplating in what we now perceive as more modern forms of democracy. And what is interesting here is that after the fall of the Roman Republic and until the American Revolution, democracy was actually scarce, and certainly not the norm for how countries organised. The way many of us live now is actually at odds with much of human history. And while there are many reasons for this, one of the key concerns was that democracies would almost inevitably devolve into autocracies. Whether you believe this to be true or not, I think it is reasonable to state that while desirable, democracies have proved hard to sustain over long periods of time. When it comes to America, democracy couldn't be applied in the classic sense. People simply wouldn't be able to partake in government themselves in a land so vast, and consequently, the word republic began to appear as an alternative option. Here's a quote from the book On Democracy by Robert Dahl. "A pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, and a republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place." This was a new distinction. Such ideas of representation had not yet been fully imagined. Prior republics, including Rome, would all still fit into the traditional understanding of direct democracy. But I'm not going to dwell on the words themselves too much here, as they can actually be used interchangeably. The point I want to make here is that as democracy was now to be realised in a much larger setting, a complete reimagining of how it would be implemented was required. The founding fathers of America were aware of just how fragile democracy could be. A good example of this actually being shown came shortly after the Declaration of Independence with Shays' Rebellion in 1786. During which thousands of armed men took to the streets. They refused to pay taxes or debits, and subsequently tried to overthrow the government of the time. This was a stark reminder of just how precarious such a system could be. One of the founding fathers, George Mason, echoed his concerns to the Federal Convention. Here he states, "From the nature of man, we may be sure that those who have power in their hands will always, if they can, increase it." So, concentrations of power on such a scale, it was thought, could be dangerous and wouldn't actually last long. This isn't a city-state we're talking about, but a representative democracy for the masses of people. And that brought with it all the problems one could expect. The principle still stood, however, that the people would still elect their officials. They just wouldn't be involved in the decision-making themselves. The founding fathers, however, believed the system itself would need to work with the grain of human nature, and consequently would work to keep the elected officials themselves in check. A key part of the structure of the American system at its founding was safeguarding it from the folly of mankind. The founding fathers expected conflicting interests and factionalism to take shape, as it always would, and knew that these impulses could prove harmful to those outside of each given faction. The governing structure, therefore, was to be broken up, and consisted of an executive branch, a legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Each was only granted limited power, and would be able to keep the others in check. On top of this, there was also the Bill of Rights, and the legislative branch was also broken up into two chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives. So this means each piece of legislation a sitting president wanted to pass into law would have to be approved here before it was allowed to be signed into law. In this regard, the president isn't as powerful as many might think. The system itself means that a government is hard to control, and that the people may actually be denied their electoral promises not due to the leader, but due to the actual system of government itself. We could also argue that as time has gone on, the government has actually become less democratic, as even more information is now kept from the public. Organisations such as the FBI and the CIA are kept out of the public control. Other democratic countries, such as Britain, though operating under different systems, have encountered similar issues. Should the unelected courts be able to overrule the government? Should international law be able to overrule a nation state? And who is actually responsible for proposing such laws? The European Union is actually a good example of an international body that proposes law via individuals who haven't actually been elected and can't actually be removed. As countries become linked, new threats emerge and more information is kept from the public. This does provide, and has provided, challenges to the idea of democracy. Bye for now. Take care.